The adder is our only venomous snake. Often shy and retiring, the best chance of spotting one is while they're out basking in the spring sunshine. It's also one of the Mendip Hills National Landscape's champion species.
These are a small select suite of 8 key species which thrive in quality habitats. These canaries in a coal mine are a good measure of environmental conditions and help by both driving conservation initiatives and raising awareness of the habitats in which they live. Surprisingly short and stocky, and possessing both a distinct zigzag along its back and a copper-coloured eye, it's impossible to confuse the adder with any other creature. Despite a large range across the UK, the adder is yet another species to have undergone a massive decline, with 90% of known sites possessing 10 or fewer adults. Fortunately, a healthy population still exists across the Mendip Hills. John Dickson of the Reptile and Amphibian group for Somerset has an intimate knowledge of both the adder and its distribution across the Mendip Hills.
The adders like various habitats. I guess the core habitat, what you would describe as the sort of favourite habitat, might be heathland like we've got here, so gorse and heather and all of this sort of a community that's associated with heathland. But they're also found in some woodland where you get openings in the woodland like rides and clearings where the sun can get down to the ground so that they've got opportunities to thermoregulate and to bask. They like wild places. They're not very well adapted to agricultural landscapes really. So where you get places that are a little bit less managed than others, that's the sort of places you'll find adders. They spend most of their life around what's called the hibernaculum, which is the place where they spend the winter. And that's the sort of centre of the population. It's a really important feature in the landscape for adders. The main emergence from hibernation occurs in March, and at that time they have a period that lasts about 6 to 8 weeks, which is known as the lying out period. What they're trying to do in this lying out period is get maximum exposure to the sun, so they take every opportunity to bask, which makes them very conspicuous. What they're doing is they're getting themselves into breeding condition. And then the males go off to look for females. And when they find a female, the male will curl up with the female and what we call mate guard. He's guarding her from other males and waiting for her to become receptive to his advances. Once they've mated, then what happens is that the population, or the majority of the population, will disperse. They don't feed very regularly. Their energy requirements are very low, so they may only feed 3-4 times a year, something like that. The majority of their food will be warm-blooded prey, so voles and shrews and things like that, possibly ground-nesting birds, but they will also take amphibians, so they'll take frogs and newts if they come across them, anything that they can catch and fit down their gullet, really. So when the rest of the population reappear in September, the females will be just about to give birth. And the females can give birth to usually an average of 6 to 8 youngsters, but it could be more.
But why has the adder's decline been so dramatic?
The decline of adders is frightening at the moment. It's really happening quickly. They're thought to have declined by something like 40% since the 1980s. But some things that come up regularly are habitat fragmentation. So where a population gets broken by a road going through the middle of it, or some development, or even some intensive agriculture, and you end up with populations that have so few animals that they're no longer sustainable. Another source of disturbance is people with dogs. First of all, it's great disturbance for the adders, but also it's a risk to the dogs. Most dogs can survive an adder bite, but you don't want your dog to get bitten by an adder. It's going to be an uncomfortable experience for it. The Mendip Hills are important for adders, at least at a local scale. It's a wonderful place for adders. There's a lot of good habitat up here, and so we've got quite a lot of adders here. And if we compare it with some of the other sites in Somerset, like the Quantock Hills, for example, where there's also a lot of good adder habitat, we find that the Mendips has much larger populations of adders than other places like the Quantocks. So it is an important site for adders. There are certain things that landowners and stakeholders can do to conserve adders. Creating embankments with good south-facing banks to them, these are the sort of things that adders might find attractive as hibernacular. So you can put in various features that make hibernation for the adders possible. Also, you can provide sort of areas of scrubland with gaps in amongst it that allow for basking and let the sun down into the sort of back gaps within the scrub. Another thing that landowners can do is to make sure that adders have connectivity across the landscape. Creating linear structures like dry stone walls, perhaps putting some gorsey scrub in as a sort of corridor between the two. That sort of thing enables adders to move around the landscape and stops them getting isolated.
So how can you ensure the Mendips continue to be a stronghold for the mercurial and enigmatic adder? Attend an adder survey training session run by the Reptile and Amphibian group for Somerset and volunteer to help with annual surveys. Keep dogs on leads on nature reserves between February and May to prevent disturbance to breeding adders. And avoid parking on grassy verges in the spring and summer where adders may be basking.
It's only the interactions between all of the species in an ecosystem that maintains the stability of that ecosystem. And the way I like to look at this is to imagine the ecosystem as a giant game of Jenga. And if the ecosystem is the Jenga tower and the extinction of each species is a block removed, it's very easy to see how you're going to collapse the entire ecosystem by removing the species one by one. There are good reasons to conserve adders.